part 2 of Unfuck the Poor, Chapter 9, Only Villains. When we last left it, the Shah of Iran had just been hit in the eyeball with a gas canister. Ha! Now, it is actually funny that the Shah got hit in the eyeball with a gas canister. He deserved it. The Shah was an asshole, and I can be specific. Trying to combat inflation, Iran released an army of, quote, inspectors upon the nation's bazaars, hoping to root out profiteers and hoarders, things that cause inflation, for which the inspectors would receive cash bonuses. Within a year, 250,000 bazaars had been closed, 8,000 bazaris had been jailed, and over 20,000 shopkeepers and businessmen had been deported to, well, they were actually just shipped off to remote areas in Iran. Those bazaars and the shopkeepers essentially financed Iran's network of Islamic schools, they paid college budgets, and they made up 80% of donations to the clergy. So, the clergy was pissed. But young people were also pissed. Iran was not the West, but that was the foundation on which the Shah wished to build the new Iran. That was the dream he sold to everyone. It was a near mirror image of Western culture, the obsession with stuff, which to many Iranians was in complete opposition to their faith, to those for whom faith was relevant. And in 1977, the Shah targeted the religious leader with the largest public following, Ayatollah Khomeini, and that was a bad move. It sparked a 25,000-person riot in Tabriz, resulting in 20 dead and essentially the destruction of the city center. Like clockwork, the end of the Islamic 40-day mourning periods signaled the beginning of more riots. This did not mean universal support for Khomeini, though. Iranians were afraid to have their names published alongside their disapproval of Khomeini, while they no longer feared being outed for the criticism of the Shah. Said an anonymous woman, because of the whole "I don't want Khomeini knowing who I am" thing, quote, "We are frightened of what would happen to women if a theocracy develops in Iran. The mullahs have always been demagogues. They have no program for running the country. There would be chaos. Eventually, the communists would come." End quote. The Shah's oppressive and militaristic rule in Iran extended beyond Iran's borders and was not merely a new development in the failing state era of 1973 to 1979, with a request to the State Department in 1963 to deport 25 U.S.-based Iranian students back to Iran so they could face prosecution for speaking out against the Shah. Per the Shah, these Iranian students were communist agitators engaging in violence against Iran, committing such unspeakable acts as publishing opinion pieces in student newspapers and participating in sit-ins and hunger strikes. See, I told you the Shah was an asshole. The State Department looked into it and, finding jack shit, no one was deported. Said Supreme Court Justice William Douglas, quote,
"Bobby Kennedy called me once that Dean Rusk had gotten a word from the Persian ambassador that the Shah wanted some of the Iranian students sent home. Dean Rusk represented to Bobby as Attorney General that these were communists and we better get rid of them. Bobby called me because we had both been to Persia and he knew that I knew something about the Persian situation. I told him that that meant that the Shah was making up lists for the firing squad when they got back, and that that should not be done unless there was a real issue of the national security of this country, because these students were lawfully here. I mean, they were students. They were studying. I said, before I do that, Bobby, I'd make a check on every one of them on the list. He said, good idea, and hung up. About 40 days later, I got another call from Bobby. He said, the FBI report is in, and not a bloody one of these kids is a communist. So I just told Russ to go chase himself.
End quote. Such was the relationship between the Shah and the U.S. State Department, and such was the paranoia of the Shah. The Shah had been disappearing political opponents, all of them conveniently labeled communists. Thousands were executed, though the numbers are neither well documented nor apparently of any interest. Khomeini estimated the number murdered at 100,000. Other, less biased estimates put the number closer to 10,000, while the official Iranian murder logs listed only 2 executions for 1979 alone. Figures on torture and political prisoners also vary, though one particularly insightful account of torture practices managed to make its way into a 1980 Washington Post article, quote, "In interviews, the Shah was inclined to portray all political activists behind bars as terrorists. Many were. It is clear that some were not, and AI cites theologians, writers, theater directors, actors, and university teachers arrested for nonviolent political activities. It is also clear that prisoners were tortured. The testimony from many sources is overwhelming, including this account from an ex-prisoner published in Index on Censorship. The torture room, resembles an ancient Egyptian tomb and is reserved for those suspected of being terrorists or accused of having made attempts on the life of the Shah or a member of the royal family. Not every prisoner goes through the same process, but generally this is what happens to a prisoner of the first importance. First, he is beaten by several torturers at once with sticks and clubs. If he doesn't confess, he is hanged upside down and beaten. If this doesn't work, he is homosexually raped. If he still shows signs of resistance, he is given electric shock, which turns him into a howling dog. If he is still obstinate, his nails and sometimes all his teeth are pulled out." End quote. It is a matter of fact that the Shah had detractors detained, tortured, and murdered. The extent to which this occurred seems to be unknowable. Consider that his appearance alongside Jimmy Carter in 1977 at the White House was met with, let's say, cynicism, as Carter had been pushing a human rights initiative which would have been undermined by hosting a known human rights abuser. To Carter's credit, he was so frustrated by having to deal with the Shah that by 1979, the facade of diplomacy dissolved. Once the Shah fled Iran and wound up in Mexico seeking cancer treatment, Kissinger, damn it, the guy's still around, and the rest of Carter's White House was droning on and on about letting the Shah come to America. Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Z-Big if you're nasty, pestered the president about letting the Shah into America nearly every day, and on July 27, 1979, Carter had heard enough. Quote, "Fuck the Shah," Carter snapped at his national security advisor. "The Shah had a safe place to stay for the moment. Let him stay there." That would be Mexico. End quote. By 1979, the Shah was no longer the U.S.'s problem. He was more or less just a pain in the ass. And the Iranian Revolution, which set Iran on an unstable trajectory we're dealing with today, went unchallenged by the U.S., who had at one point justified spending $600 million in defense aid to Iran, and whose intelligence presence had indicated that in the case of revolution, the Shah would be unable to hold power without U.S. aid. So, aid was withheld. The Shah fled to Egypt, and then Morocco, and then the Bahamas, and then Mexico, where Carter screamed, "Fuck the Shah." And then, against every ounce of Carter's human form, probably, the Shah came to the U.S. on October 23, 1979, for cancer treatment at Manhattan's New York Hospital, where, confined to his hospital bed for weeks due to health complications and surgery, he wound up causing the biggest clusterfuck since the Bay of Pigs. The admission of the Shah to the U.S. was seen by Khomeini as an act of aggression against Iran, and on November 4, 1979, a group of Iranian students broke into the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and thus began the 444-day Iranian hostage crisis. Carter had warned his cabinet about such a clusterfuck in vague terms, but he did not offer them a shit-eating grin and tell Kissinger he was a fuckwit. The demand on the U.S. government was to extradite the Shah for the purported and verified crimes against humanity, crimes against his own Iranians. The decision to admit the Shah to the U.S. for treatment and the subsequent refusal to detain and extradite him was, to the new Islamic Republic of Iran, a transgressive act. For more on this part of the Shah's life, I recommend David Harris's The Crisis, the President, the Prophet, and the Shah, 1979, and the Coming of Militant Islam. The Shah was kicked out of the States and went to Panama, where his stay was protested. Panamanians didn't like the Shah to the extent that the Panama government provided a militant Marxist bodyguard who lectured the Shah on being a tool of American imperialism and complicit in the U.S. oppression of the Third World. Normal deposed dictator stuff, I guess. By some accounts, the Shah was torn between two identities, that of his rule-by-force father, whose kingdom he, quote, inherited, and the well-liked humanitarian Mossadegh, whose democracy had been cooed to him. His land reforms wound up creating a new rift between Iranian farmers and creating enemies of wealthy landowners and clergy, though there is virtually no distinction. And this is a key parallel to the modern United States. The lower classes, frequently lied to, pandered to, and in essence abused by those in power, put their faith in a sole powerful figure, Ayatollah Khomeini, who, with the support and backing of Iranian nationalists and Marxists, overthrew the Shah, establishing Iran as an Islamic republic, which was also unpopular with the nationalists and Marxists and spurred yet more militant action. Enter the Kurdish 10,000-plus deaths and Khuzestan 100-plus deaths rebellions, which were violently quashed by the new Islamic government. Tens of thousands of anti-Islamist Iranians were executed, including former government officials and ministers under the Shah, as well as Islamists who were not radical enough. Universities were closed for 3 years to purge them of their, they purged the faculties and libraries and converted universities to Islamic institutions. Recall that Iranian businesses had indeed funded most of the Islamic schools and universities, from solidarity to fratricide. The right's descent to armed insurrection of the U.S. Capitol is, to my mind, no different from the Islamic theocracy that overthrew the Shah, with the exception given to the fact that one succeeded and the other, let's just say the far right is a lot less threatening at this point, even with all those guns. They appear to be physically unfit for revolt and utterly incompetent. But revolution doesn't die, and by their nature, revolutionaries do not back down. The 2017 to 2018 Iranian protests, which resulted in thousands of arrests and hundreds of executions, were in direct opposition to the theocratic government, and protesters want their dictator, Ali Khamenei, dead. From a 1953 coup to lopsided trade negotiations of the Consortium Agreement to 25 years of resource exploitation, dictatorial oppression, and government incompetence and brutality, to a decisive loyalty switch that was timed perfectly to coincide with the end of an oil trade agreement, to 40 years of ongoing conflict against even more oppressive Islamist rule, tainted with an unknown number of deaths in the tens of thousands, if not more, and I don't recall a single economic definition we've learned so far in this book that explains the mathematical justification for the utter chaos that results from the calculated removal of a democratically elected prime minister in exchange for the brutal exploitation of an entire nation. Comparative advantage comes close, yet Iran couldn't use its own comparative oil advantage to its own advantage. The US and Britain usurped that comparative advantage at the expense of, again, an entire fucking nation. Saudi Arabia leveraged its comparative advantage in exchange for lots of support against other Middle Eastern countries. You and I, we just pump gas. If the United States is willing to overthrow democratically elected leaders to create lower prices and a steady and protected supply of petroleum, bananas, and coffee, is it a stretch to assume that the U.S. is willing to exploit its own citizens for the same thing? Though, consider this. If the government's goal in overthrowing foreign governments is to install pro-U.S. regimes to guarantee trade supplies, ostensibly in favor of U.S. corporations, then what is the U.S.'s goal at home? Hint, it has nothing to do with the public interest. Our obsession with free trade abroad, to the extent that we will completely overturn elections in foreign countries, extends equally to our economic obsessions at home. Violence abroad is more easily skewed. Wars are fought with bullets and bombs in foreign countries, but are fought with words at home, propaganda being the approved talking points for both the political right and left. In the way we talk about foreign conflicts, who is the enemy of whom, why bombing or assassination is justified, relentlessly framed as matters of economics, or just as often, matters of freedom and democracy, words used with such abandon they cease to have any functional definition. In 2021, we have not found a renewed interest in defending democracy. Our foreign policy is much the same as it has been since the end of World War II. We are not interested in the middle class, low and moderate income workers, or the poor. We are not interested in supporting actual democracy abroad or at home. But I digress. The flip side of the fall of Iran is supposed to be the dissolution of trade itself. That's how I framed it, at least. At a certain point, due simply to the constant repetition over time, we believe outright in the validity of false economic proofs originally concocted to lend credibility to dubious international policy, and they eventually turn into ideological fantasy. The fall of Iran was the result of a quarter-century of locked-in dependence on Iranian oil and the installation of a brutal monarch who became unmanageable. A revolution 25 years in the making, and yet it's the 6-year span, 1973 to 1979, of domestic unrest that frames the narrative. There are Iranians devoted to preserving the significance of the 1953 coup against Mossadegh, those who see his displacement and prosecution as being the inciting event of Iran's departure from the path of true prosperity, not the 1979 revolution. The dream of real democracy in Iran indeed died in 1953. The rest has been mere detail. We are getting quite obscure now, to the point of talking about how we talk about talking points, talking about trade and domestic policy. We can abstract this to such a dull point that we can equate individual and corporate freedom as one and the same. We can get the points backwards, back ourselves into logic corners where gaslighting becomes an acceptable alternative to truth. See alternative facts. See the foreseeable negative consequences on the domestic front of trade wars while framing them as successes. See also the open knowledge that wealth distribution simply does not occur from the, quote, top down, and yet the policy remains a major hit in the conservative camp. See also our deep-rooted belief that the Middle East can be tamed by brute force with sentiments like, quote, nuke 'em all. At the same time, we're cynical enough to believe just as readily that completely withdrawing from engagements in the Middle East will at once spare American lives while allowing the Middle East to dissolve into chaos and crumble. See also the openness of discussion surrounding the pillaging of natural resources once chaos has taken over. The reality is bleak and unclean. The U.S. serves no real purpose in the Middle East nor anywhere we maintain military bases, yet we owe significant reparations for the undue damage we've caused and for the damage we will cause by backing away and leaving a void. This was written before Biden pulled troops out of Afghanistan and the Taliban took over, but as an editorial aside, I would just like to say, I fucking told you so. Ask the indigenous of North America. Ask Black Americans. Ask the victims of police brutality and the working poor. Ask any of the Americans who lost jobs and houses due to the incompetence of the COVID-19 response. The only rational solution is to slink off and admit not defeat but criminal abuse, and then commit to reconciliation. This will never happen. We are at least determined to never let it happen. With the fall of Iran and the rise of Saudi Arabia as the United States' new BFF comes the era of Reaganomics, a term so incalculably moronic that it has stuck in the American vernacular and become neoliberal religion. Neoliberal theory requires its core components be as stupid as possible. It is no coincidence that the supply-side economic practices of the Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher years resulted in unstable trade balance and increasing inequality, the two things the very smart people said would be bolstered by such policies. But you don't have to take my word for it. I've already supplied the charts that show the instability during the Reagan administration. See the previous deepening trade deficits and accelerated loss of capacity utilization. Reaganomics is trickle-down economic theory. That is the belief that if you cut taxes on the wealthy, they will magically sprinkle money on you, an economic golden shower, if you will. Supply-side economics. Who exactly are the suppliers? Corporations who make stuff. Policies that favor the producers of stuff theoretically should boost economic output. Just ignore the fact that without purchasing power on the consumer side, this whole thing is bullshit. Ronald Reagan was an unqualified president from 1981 to 1989 whose rhetoric still serves as the lubrication for conservative masturbatory economic policy. His nickname was Dutch. The Gipper, the Teflon President, the Communicator. None of these are particularly interesting, but just to give you an idea of how fucking stupid people are, the Gipper is possibly the most used nickname. It is the name of a character from a film Reagan was in when he was an actor. The American public voted for the character that a man played in a movie, kind of like how Americans voted for the character that Donald Trump played on The Apprentice. Margaret Thatcher was the female Ronald Reagan from Great Britain. She's anti-labor, anti-social programs, and a friend to war criminals. She's dead, and so is Reagan, and that's a good thing. When Nixon abruptly dissolved the dollar's gold backing, the global economy floundered, briefly finding stability in oil. When the price of oil increased in 1973, more floundering ensued. Most of the 1970s was spent trying to salvage the sanctity of the dollar by pegging it to something near equal to the value of gold. And oil turned out to be just the ticket, with the dollar finding firm footing finally in Saudi oil, for which the groundwork had been laid in the 1945 meeting between FDR and Abdulaziz Ibn Saud. I told you a long time ago that was very important. Remember, they did an airfield thing and business training stuff. Anyway, with a long-term supply of oil backing its value, the dollar came of age in the 1980s. Realizing that oil dependence was a bad look, the U.S. made moves to profit off the one thing the U.S. government had control over producing, the dollar. One revelation of the oil-shocked 70s, because the dollar backed most currencies, its major weakness was its exposure. After all, if everybody has a gold brick, gold bricks become worthless. But If an opulent minority hoards those gold bricks and everything is priced in relation to gold bricks, then the gold brickless majority is more motivated to work for gold dust. In this example, there is no third party to mediate between the opulent minority and the majority. And this is Reaganomics in a nutshell. Just like the new aristocracy of the American Revolution saw itself as a check on the poor majority because the landed class was inherently savvier and more intelligent, Reaganomics presupposed the wisdom of the American corporation and its wealthy ruling class. If you just let the market run its course, deregulate, reduce taxes, cut government spending to encourage people to get jobs, and promote the production of stuff, then naturally the wealth will spread to all. The real-time inflationary pressures in Iran were 1. Decreased supply of goods, and 2. Increased price due to the influx of foreign cash, scarcity and high demand. I'm just putting this here as a reminder because this ultimately led to revolt. Reaganomics sought to 1. Decrease the supply of government dollars, and 2. Increase access to debt financing globally, scarcity and high demand. This is, of course, a different kind of inflation. It's the kind of balloon you don't see because it's so massive we're all just kind of riding on top of it. The establishment of the petrodollar is little more than wordplay and pinky promises. Remember how we discussed the Hawala system earlier, where 10 to 15 barrels of oil was equal to $35, was equal to 1 ounce of gold? The petrodollar eliminated the gold part, making the price of oil directly tied to the value of the dollar. The petrodollar, when manipulated this way, is literally an oil-backed security. When Nixon panic called Saudi Arabia in the middle of the night begging them to buy U.S. Treasury securities, well, they were essentially recycling their petrodollars. Here's another simple diagram. Saudi Arabian oil goes to the U.S. Saudi Arabia receives U.S. dollars. The Saudi-held dollar comes back to the United States Treasury, and the United States Treasury hands over U.S. Treasury bonds to Saudi Arabia. For those who are visual learners, there is a graphic on the website that you can take a look at. It's basically debt eating the USA, eating oil, eating treasury bonds, eating Saudi Arabia, and then pooping itself back out onto itself. It's basically a big tangle of bullshit. Anyway, this is an important framework because the U.S. essentially talked Saudi Arabia into giving the U.S. a loan from the money that it just made on the sale of oil to the United States. So, this is probably a whole thing. And now we have actually completed a loop that we started earlier. We've now made up the second half of the Treasury's securities sales. The Treasury sells T-notes, T-bills, and T-bonds domestically as well as to foreign countries. In this specific case, the oil profits from Saudi Arabia are reinvested into the U.S. Treasury. And because the U.S. only produces one commodity, the dollar, it is very interested in getting as many parties as possible tied up in the dollar web. And because the dollar is tied to literally not a goddamn thing, when those securities mature, the U.S. just creates the fucking money out of thin air and pays the balance in full. But let's go back, because we're still dealing with the 1980s. So we have this petrodollar reinvestment scheme, and then because this works really well for the U.S., Nixon, well, correlation versus causation applies here, Nixon removes the controls on foreign investment, essentially rules that limit how much domestic money can be invested abroad. Executive Order 11387, signed into effect January 1st, 1968, was founded on Section 5B of the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act. You don't have to remember any of these dates or any of these numbers, but what it did was it set restraints on private capital investment abroad. So this was very old. These restraints made up the Foreign Direct Investment Regulations, which were part of Lyndon Johnson's Foreign Direct Investments Program. In other words, U.S. corporations had restrictions on how much money could leave the United States. Nixon set out to liberalize these restrictions by essentially phasing them out altogether. By 1973, the restrictions were full-on hippie liberal, and U.S. companies, losing drilling rights in the Middle East due to nationalization, sold off their remaining rights and took the profits to reinvest. Technically, Nixon's phase-out approach worked. U.S. companies reinvested at home, but the unintended consequence was the massive liberalization of international lending, also known as global finance. Now, because banks sell U.S. T-bills, T-bonds, and T-notes, and because the U.S. was encouraging oil producers to reinvest their profits into Treasury securities, That meant US and British banks were reabsorbing recycled petrodollars made possible by this liberalization, meaning they could then use those petrodollars to generate loans, having to keep only a portion in reserve. Because this is global finance, petrodollars from, say, Saudi Arabia can be used to purchase T-bonds from Citibank, for example. And the money from the sale of the T-bonds can then be loaned to another country, preferably a developing country in places that really need loans, like Africa, Asia, or Latin America. That way, the countries can use those loans for development projects to then make money to pay off the debt, which in turn makes it possible for the bank to turn a profit, which guarantees the U.S. Treasury can pay out the T-bond when it matures. Are you lost? Because it took a really long time to write that, and I'm not even sure 100% I know what it means, so let's take a step back. We're back at Steve Mnuchin's pool. You have Air Force Ones, and I have $100. I sail my money across the pool, and I receive the Air Force Ones from you. Now I have the Air Force Ones, and I say, hey, if you give me back that $100, I'll give you $120 next year. Just give that bill to my friend there. And you, because that sounds good to you, you say, sure, and then you hand the $100 to my friend, John Travolta, who winks at you and then he wanders off behind a hedge. Now, behind that hedge, John Travolta sees a kid digging in the dirt with a spoon and he says, hey kid, I'll give you $90 so you can buy a shovel and a wheelbarrow. And the kid, holding a spoonful of dirt, says, hey, aren't you that guy? And John Travolta's like, no kid, that's another guy, take the money. So the kid takes the money and agrees to pay back $90 plus interest to John Travolta. In total, the kid owes $110. Who knows what the fuck the kid is going to do with the shovel and the wheelbarrow, or if it will make enough money to pay back the loan, but this seems like a good kid, and worst case scenario, John Travolta is just going to take the shovel and the wheelbarrow and probably the kid's spoon too. Just like a bank can issue a subprime mortgage to a homebuyer, banks can issue subprime loans to developing countries. Because they are developing and not developed, they are inherently subprime. But a bank cannot foreclose on a country and hire an REO contractor to winterize its pipes. What the bank can do, as in the case of the Latin American debt crisis, is use the International Monetary Fund, not a fund at all, but a loan shark, and the World Bank to restructure the national budgets of Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, and Nicaragua, Peru, and Uruguay. This is like a homeowner who is behind on the mortgage going to the bank and asking for a loan modification. If the bank is not run by Steve Mnuchin, the loan gets modified, though, as we've seen, it is often not in the interest of the borrower. In the case of the IMF and World Bank, restructuring a nation's debt is done on the condition that the overseers, the IMF and World Bank, also get to restructure the nation's budgets, the way a nation handles its money spending. The overseers have specific goals. Quote, from the outset of the debt crisis, the stated goals of the creditor's strategy have been fourfold. 1. To prevent an international banking crisis. 2. To restore the debtor country's credit standing in and access to private foreign capital markets. 3. To restructure the debtor economies for sustained economic revival. And 4, to make market liberalization a centerpiece of economic restructuring. End quote. So John Travolta's let this kid borrow $90, which is tied to the price of the Air Force Ones you sold me. The kid went off and got a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and I'll be damned if the kid says that's too slow. A dump truck and backhoe would move tons more dirt. And look at all the dirt the kid already moved. I mean, just look at it. He was only using a spoon. Imagine what industrial equipment could do for the kid. The kid needs more Air Force One money, and hell, the kid is already wearing a pair of Air Force Ones, so John Travolta offers the kid a specific financial instrument, a loan based on the future sale of Air Force Ones. Air Force Ones are really popular. They're modestly priced. Everybody loves them. The kid's gonna buy more. The US dollar loan on Air Force One futures seems like a good deal. Fingers crossed. And then, if you'll recall, in Iran at the same time, the Shah screams, "Fuck you, I drink your milkshake!" And Air Force One prices shoot up. Now, the kid, who by the way indeed needs the Air Force Ones as well as the money, is in a pinch. Air Force One prices have tripled, and the kid can't do industrial labor without shoes. Nah, fuck, gotta wear shoes to use this equipment, gotta use the equipment to pay back the loan, which is in a foreign currency based on the value of the shoes. Fuck. What are we doing, by the way, here in America? I don't know. Probably hanging out in Steve Mnuchin's backyard yelling about how the price of Air Force Ones is really, really concerning. Probably. Anyway, replace shoes with oil and the kid from Mexico, and you have the start of the Latin American debt crisis. Latin American countries were offered loans backed by oil futures through commercial banks when those Latin American countries were developing. They were doing well and they were good kids, so John Travolta loaned them more money. But hey, it's not John Travolta's fault that the Shah is a dick. The developing industrial nations of Latin America couldn't do industry on the scale needed with the huge spike in oil prices, and without industrial scale, they couldn't pay back those oil-backed loans. Maybe you'd say that this situation wouldn't be too bad. Mexico could bootstrap it and ramp up production to try to make up the difference between the peso and the dollar as the price of oil, and therefore the value of the dollar, spikes. At least, they could bootstrap it just long enough to make it through the rough patch. It would suck. It'd be like eating ramen packs without water for your 1 meal a day ration while also conserving water, but it could be somewhat manageable, right? Well, do you remember how adjustable rate mortgages get sold to people? You have a job, you're doing well. If the interest rate goes up, you'll still have your job, and hey, you might be even making more money. It's totally affordable. Adjustable rate loans get sold to developing countries the same way because they are subprime. So even if Mexico could Super Saiyan productivity to meet the inflationary pressures of the rising dollar, they would not be able to also handle the increased interest payments on their adjustable rate loans. And they couldn't. With the increased loan payments, Mexico took a dark turn and took out additional loans to cover the increased interest on the old loans. In turn, banks raised the price of the loans and reduced their maturity duration. A little money cost a lot of money, and it had to be paid back really fast. Enter the economist saying a rational person should not take these loans, and well, they'd be right, right? A borrower with good credit could certainly afford a loan on these terms, but they are bad terms, so no creditworthy borrower would take them. Latin American countries facing mountains of interest payments, to say nothing of the principal itself, went straight to the loans that were available, high interest, short maturity. The banks and the Latin American debtors had fucked themselves. It was a cluster. This is known as Ponzi financing. Charles Ponzi was an inventive 1920s fuckboy who offered huge returns on investments in a ridiculously short amount of time. He whittled it down from 90 days to 30. How'd he do it? He took the investments made by customers today to pay off the profits of the customers from yesterday. It is obvious that this is unsustainable and highly sketch, and yet it is simply the more streamlined approach of the modern financial system. Anyway, Ponzi financing for a loan would be taking out a new loan to pay off the old one. Loans on loans on loans, turtles, all the way down. Now, we can inject the IMF and World Bank in the issue of restructuring a nation's economy as you hand over a $4 billion loan. In the case of Mexico, this took the form of President Miguel de la Madrid Hurtado's 10-point economic program, which includes such classics as budget cuts, higher taxes, price increases, postponement of public works, higher interest rates, and the, quote, relaxation of foreign exchange controls. You'd be forgiven if you think the last one is vague. It is, because it means banks can trade and swap the nation's debt on the global finance market, otherwise known as speculative trading, which is something you'd arguably want to put in vague terms on your inauguration day. And yes, this is the exact same thing that happened during the 2008 housing crisis, except instead of homeowners, you're dealing with whole fucking countries. Multiply this by half a dozen Latin American countries and let it, quote, recover for half a generation, and you have the lost decade, a period of economic collapse, insolvency, austerity, the 10-point program, and the birth of a shadowy financial market that profits off trading the debt obligations of entire fucking countries. Credit default swaps and debt conversions, very similar to the sketch activity that brought about the 2008 economic crash. In short, these austerity measures didn't fucking work. In fact, people who were paying attention noted that the lost decade was the start of a more significant problem. Quote, what needs to be done is to convince Washington that leaving it to the market is not a viable self-help solution, and that rather than forcing it on Latin American governments, these governments should be encouraged to find blends of controls and market liberalizations appropriate to their current parlous circumstances and longer-run developmental needs. Informed U.S. opinion is awakening to the realization that unpleasant repercussions from prolonging Latin America's lost decade could spill northward. To many, it is also apparent that economic recovery in Latin America would create trade and investment opportunities southward that would substantially reduce the international fragility of the U.S. economy. It should not be impossible, therefore, to disabuse Washington of the ideological fantasies that now shape its economic strategy toward Latin America." End quote. Of course, it is practically impossible to disabuse Washington of ideological fantasy. Those ideological fantasies are what spawned the global reach of the dollar and the financialization that took place of actual trade. It is the same ideological fantasy that led to the next great debacle in trade, NAFTA. As Felix mentioned above, informed U.S. opinion saw the liberalization of Latin America for what it was, the commodification of humans themselves. It is now time to briefly revisit an earlier definition, liberalization. Liberal, in the classical philosophical sense, liberalization is the freedom of the self. The self is autonomous, without interjection by the state or an arbitrary higher power. Liberalism is the rejection of outside constraints, whatever those are, the opinion of others, the imposition of another on one's free will. In the neoliberal sense, liberalization means the rejection of constraints and opinions on the corporation and capital. Conservative, in the classical philosophical sense, the belief that the self cannot be free. It is too weak and therefore needs structure and hierarchy and authoritarian intervention. It gives no indication of what exactly constitutes a morally just hierarchy, but presumably it is a governing body that will hold all to account in a standardized moral public philosophy. We have come so far. I return to these definitions because I think we are indeed all liberals in the classical sense. Only a sadist would assume humanity, themselves included, needs an authoritarian hand to guide the masses through existence. It is indeed at direct odds with the individual freedoms pursued by the modern conservative. To say what one wants without being canceled, to carry a weapon wherever they go, to possess property and do what they wish with and on that property, the rejection of government influence, arguably the hallmark of authoritarianism. The liberalization of countries has nothing to do with individual freedom and everything to do with the freedom of enterprise, that divine right of the perpetual person, the corporation. So far removed are humans from the philosophical basis of our beliefs that we heap our individual desires, our core beliefs, onto the corporate person while mistakenly believing we are helping ourselves. This, indeed, is my secondary introduction to NAFTA and the return to the title of this exceedingly long chapter, Only Villains. On the oil front, instability in the supply chain leads to pricing instability, something the Carter administration recognized and vowed to address using all means necessary, including military intervention if needed. In the Middle East, the petrodollar breeds a new dollar-backed security, the weapon dollar. Geopolitical instability makes long-term contracts such as the consortium agreement untenable, while the militarization of oil-producing countries to engage in conflict with their neighbors can produce spikes in oil prices and therefore higher profits. Instability is, through this lens, profitable. Quote, "As it turns out, knowing the oil income of Middle East countries is almost all we need in order to predict the overall value of arms deliveries 3 years later. 3 unbroken regularities become apparent. First, we can see that since the mid-1960s, every danger zone was followed by an outbreak of Middle East energy conflict. Thus, in 1966, the performance of the Petro Corps fell below that of the Fortune 500, which was then followed by the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. The Petro Corps entered the danger zone again in 1972, and that was followed by the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. The next danger zone developed in 1977 and 1978, followed by the Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis of 1979, and then by the Iraq-Iran War, which began in 1980. The most recent danger zone opened in 1986, followed by the intensification of the Iraq-Iran War, and eventually culminating in the Gulf War of 1990-1991. The second observation is that subsequent to the outbreak of each of these conflicts, the Petro Corps' rate of return moved to surpass or at least match the Fortune 500 average. And finally, we can see that no energy conflict erupted without the Petro Corps first falling into a danger zone." End quote. In other words, whenever there is conflict in the Middle East, there is profit. Logically, it follows that where there is conflict, there is justification. Justification for U.S. involvement, whether in bombings or arms sales. Americans respond most strongly to the good-evil ethos. The supremacy of American values and our version of democracy over all else makes it easy for us to figure out who has the high ground in international conflict. Always the United States. We can make a villain out of anyone so long as the result is profitable. It is the 1980s. In the Middle East, we have an ongoing conflict, while in Latin America, we have a spiraling Ponzi debt financialization scheme. This is to say nothing of the rest of the world. Those of informed U.S. opinion who foresaw the northern migration of Latin Americans to the U.S. following the lost decade would likely agree with my assertion. With the promise of profitability, anyone can be the villain. It's time to pull the pin out of NAFTA. Quote, "There shall be no barriers to free trade and no diplomatic hurdles too complex to negotiate. There shall be a unified global alliance among peaceful nations, and among free trade's detractors there shall be only villains." End quote. And that was, if you forgot, that was me like a billion pages ago. The economic restructuring of Latin American countries did not revitalize those countries as promised or hoped or expected. It did not promote economic growth, and the austerity measures managed to do nothing. And as a direct consequence, Mexico's foreign debt amounted to 56.5% of Mexico's total economic output by 1988, higher than the beginning of the sweeping austerity measures and economic reforms 6 years prior. Because Latin America literally lost a decade of economic growth, it should be no surprise to anyone, really, that migrants from Latin America would move in large numbers to the closest place with a functioning economy on the very large contiguous landmass that starts 500 miles away from Antarctica and runs all the way north to the fucking Arctic Ocean. That functioning economy, somewhere in that strip of land between, Antarctica and the North Pole, there is a close functioning economy, and that would be the United States. Obviously. As economic stability worsened in Mexico, immigration to the U.S. increased. Who would have thunk it? Total inflow from Mexico rose from 430,000 persons in the 1960s to over 680,000 through the 1970s. As you might expect, in the restructured 1980s, the number of immigrants increased dramatically, totaling more than 3 million by the end of the decade. These figures are for documented migrants, with estimates of undocumented migrants around 800,000. Through the 1990s, the total number of Mexican immigrants alone living in the U.S. would increase by 5 million. In the context of petrodollar instability and economic restructuring, one could interpret these migration numbers as a natural result of U.S. trade policy, from Bretton Woods to the Latin American debt crisis, and indeed, that is how I interpret these numbers. I wasn't fucking around when I said the U.S. tends to destroy everything it touches. Because austerity measures had not worked to bring about economic stability in the 1980s, a new form of liberalization was proposed for Latin America in the early to mid-90s, the Free Trade Agreement. The U.S. already had much success with the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement, FTA, in 1989, which had resulted in a whopping 2 to 3% increase in Canada's gross domestic product, and this particularly rosy interpretation of its effects. Quote, "Critics argued that the post-FTA period brought the greatest collapse of manufacturing employment since the Great Depression. This convinced the critics that it was not a North American economic slowdown that was the causal factor, but rather the different impacts of the FTA on the two economies. The mechanism involved was that of restructuring production throughout the new economic space. Plants closed in Canada, and the Canadian market was served by exports from U.S. branches of the same firm. It was anticipated that this restructuring would continue under NAFTA, with a second shift of jobs out of Canada and the U.S. as well, this time to low-wage production locations in Mexico." End quote. A version, or the ephemeral idea of NAFTA, had been floating around in Washington since Reagan's first presidential run in 1980. The Reagan-Thatcher era of orgasmic liberal expansion demanded a three-nation trade bloc in North America. Canada entered first in 1988 with a bilateral agreement with the U.S., and by 1992, Mexico, Canada, and the United States started having a serious discussion about it. It met roadblocks until it added labor and environmental provisions, minor detail. These provisions did nothing. The ratification of NAFTA in January 1994 meant there was a party all over North America. There was dancing, there was a great big open finance sector that Mexico used to its advantage by selling short-term bonds backed by the U.S. dollar, and then there was also the problem of a violent uprising in the southernmost state of Chiapas that led to some currency instability and devaluation affectionately known as the peso crisis. The short of it, a year after NAFTA was ratified, the value of the peso fell by more than half. That's bad. And the long of it is this. Chase Manhattan Bank has a democracy and execution issue in Mexico. That's arguably worse. In the lead up to NAFTA, Mexico saw a huge influx of foreign cash, from $14 billion in foreign direct investments in 1991 to $22 billion by 1994. And in 1993, international mutual funds climbed an average of 37.5%, when the average equity fund gained at 13.2%. From 1989 to 1994, Latin American stocks were muy caliente, and no, I cannot believe I wrote that. NAFTA's passage was supposed to toss a lasso around that pony and ride it into the sunset. But NAFTA, the neoliberal wet dream of Mexico's President Carlos Salinas and the Mexican economy, hit a snag. At 12:30 a.m., January 1st, 1994, the official beginning of the NAFTA era was marked by the rise of a small, masked army of peasants, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, EZLN. They blocked the road to the Chiapas capital, Tuxtla Gutierrez, secured 2 Pemex gas stations, and stormed the municipal palace armed with rifles and sledgehammers. Well, fuck me if that doesn't sound like international terrorism. Oh, wait, no, it was actually an indigenous collective that had, for more than 20 years prior, established through grassroots efforts an organizational network that promoted and sought land rights and recovery for peasants, appropriation of the production process, access to credit, organization for labor unions, and protested human rights abuses. They even, and this is unique considering the time and cultural implication, encouraged women to form their own groups and agendas. One such agenda was the Revolutionary Law of Women. Quote, "First, women have the right to participate in the revolutionary struggle in the place and at the level that their capacity and will dictate, without any discrimination based on race, creed, color, or political affiliation. Second, women have the right to work and to receive a fair salary. Third, women have the right to decide the number of children they will have and take care of. Fourth, women have the right to participate in community affairs and hold leadership positions when freely and democratically elected. Fifth, women have the right to primary care in terms of their health and nutrition. Sixth, women have the right to education. Seventh, women have the right to choose whom they will be with and should not be forced to marry. Eighth, no woman should be beaten or physically mistreated by either a family member or a stranger. Rape and attempted rape should be severely punished. Ninth, women can hold leadership positions in the organization and hold military rank in the Revolutionary Armed Forces. 10th, women have all the rights and obligations set out by the revolutionary laws and regulations." End quote. The Zapatistas had intentionally staged their uprising to time with the symbolic start of NAFTA, with EZLN spokesperson Subcomandante Marcos explaining EZLN's actions against both the Mexican government and NAFTA. Quote, "Today we have taken 4 cities in Chiapas because there are no conditions for free elections in this country. This is a warning to the government that we are fed up with the lack of democracy. To us, the Free Trade Treaty is the death certificate for the ethnic peoples of Mexico." End quote. For the EZLN, the U.S.'s history of intervention to prevent the spread of communism by the Soviet threat was moot. The Cold War was long over, and no Latin poor had attempted such defiance against the neoliberal order since it had ended. The attention brought to Chiapas by the seemingly sudden rise of the Zapatistas was bad news for investors. The Zapatistas had actually come to public light in March 1993 under the suspicion of murder of 2 Mexican army officers, the response to which was a Mexican invasion of 400 troops who brutalized and raped the villagers of San Isidro Acutal before torturing a group of 13 and eliciting confessions for the murders. Between the Zapatistas and the Mexican government, tension rose to the extent of military occupation, blockades, and 4 days of jungle combat, with the Zapatistas maneuvering swiftly through their home terrain, while the Mexican army basically fell on their asses and shot each other. This lasted until May 26, 1993, when the military evacuated and the conflict simply vanished. 1993 was an election year, and it is speculated that President Salinas sought to postpone full military assault on the Zapatistas until after NAFTA was in place and after the presidential elections, at which point, it is presumed by me, Salinas would have just napalmed the jungle. In the days following the 1994 New Year's Zapatista uprising, it was revealed to the public at large, and therefore the world, that the guerrilla group was not some overnight anomaly. The Mexican government had been monitoring Zapatista activities and attempted to keep their activity unknown. In fact, they told U.S. officials prior to the House vote on NAFTA that there was no guerrilla activity. The CIA, on the other hand, did know about the Zapatistas, but they thought they were drug traffickers, a confusion the Mexican government was happy to not correct because, theoretically, they could have wiped out an entire village of peasants, calling them narcos, and been lauded as being tough on drug crime, arguably a picture of political stability. So with the appearance of stability shattered by the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, the stability of the peso faltered. It would have faltered sooner. Probably in the event of Mexico's admission of guerrilla activity on the day of the NAFTA vote, there would have been no NAFTA. But news of an earlier uprising, and more importantly, the visibility of that earlier uprising, had successfully been quashed and overshadowed by the assassination of Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo on May 24, 1993. 2 days before the Mexican army disappeared itself from the jungle. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but this is convenient. 3 days into the uprising, the Zapatistas had freed 180 prisoners, lost 50 guerrillas in gunfights, and 100 civilians had been killed. And the American press had picked up the story. In the Washington Post, a glimmer of journalistic integrity. Quote, "Chief among the rebels' stated grievances is that the North American Free Trade Agreement, which took effect on New Year's Day, will become yet another instrument for powerful American capitalists to exploit the region, drain it of natural resources, and force Indians off land they have farmed for centuries." End quote. For a country that had been liberalizing its economy as part of the IMF and World Bank restructuring to open up the country for international investment, the news of an armed guerrilla uprising at the very start of a free trade agreement reaching American newspapers is understandably concerning. The uncertainty of Mexico's ability to contain an uprising, specifically in opposition to the very trade measures and financializations bringing investment, meant that investing in Mexico was risky. Instability was the hallmark of 1994. With Mexico issuing U.S. dollar-backed debt to purchase pesos, the peso maintained strength, but it should not have. Mexico's high demand for imports, they began running a trade deficit, reflected the high value of the peso, which told investors that the peso was overvalued or inflated, and investors began pulling their money out of Mexico. To combat the loss of investment, Mexico purchased its own U.S. dollar-backed debt while at the same time honoring the securities held by investors. This depleted bank reserves in the process. By the end of 1994, the Mexican central bank had devalued the peso by more than half. Hold up. Mexico was doing the very same exact thing that the U.S. does with its currency, buys its own debt products while at the same time honoring payments on debt products held by others, including foreign governments. In fact, the situation in Mexico seems kind of similar to the situation that the U.S. occupies in general, running trade deficits with an inflated currency. So, why doesn't the dollar collapse where the peso does? Well, just remember that the dollar is, in essence, pegged to itself and nothing else. Its value just is, by converting dollars paid for oil into debt instruments that reflect that value and by the dollar being used as the numeraire for most international trade. It is a precarious position to be in, one held by mere fantasy, but that fantasy has immense value. The peso, once tied to the dollar, becomes subprime to the dollar. It cannot stand on its own. Consider, if you will, Deadpool. Most of Deadpool's appeal comes in the devastatingly handsome and apparently very tall, sexiest man alive, Ryan Reynolds, but more so the constant reminder that Deadpool somehow exists in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We see glimpses of the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters, we get tertiary characters in Colossus and Negasonic Teenage Warhead with brief cameos by not Hugh Jackman, and overall we get a regular barrage of Marvel inside jokes to keep us grounded in and build on the Marvel Universe. Deadpool is the peso pegged to X-Men's dollar. The peso can add to the dollar, but it cannot surpass nor can it detract from the dollar. If Deadpool had been a flop, it would have been a mere blip in the Marvel canon. If the value of the peso dropped to zero, it would have been a mere blip in the U.S. economy. As it were, the peso was having a bad day at the box office, and investors wanted their money back. A year after the Zapatista uprising, with the peso severely devalued, American firms were still grappling with the movie as bad metaphor for economy situation in their newly liberalized playground. Chase Manhattan Bank was particularly concerned with the performance of Mexican assets and needed the Mexican government to get its shit together. Would you believe me if I said I was about to bring up the Council on Foreign Relations again? Enter Riordan Rhett, current professor and director emeritus of Latin American Studies program at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, as well as being on the board of directors for a few closed-end mutual funds at Legg Mason Global Asset Management, also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and also a former consultant for Chase Manhattan Bank when he typed the Chase Manhattan Emerging Markets Group memo, Mexico Political Update, 13 January 1995. Rhett, a Columbia-educated American expert on Latin America, was able to provide valuable consultation on the Mexico situation to Chase Manhattan's top clients who, if we're honest, couldn't give half a fuck about Latin American anything if it's not readily converted to the dollar. At the time Rhett distributed the memo, Chase held a Latin American portfolio worth an estimated $4.5 billion, one-third of which was in Mexico alone. When the memo was leaked, Chase Manhattan attempted to save face by clarifying that, though the memo was written on Chase letterhead, it was written by a consultant on Chase payroll and not a Chase employee. Again, Rhett was paid by Chase to provide such insight and apparently had enough authority to hit send on an email to Chase's customers, but I digress. The memo got leaked to the emerging investigative newsletter Counterpunch. It earned an annotation in the May 1995 issue of Harper's, written by Counterpunch's editors Alexander Cockburn and Ken Silverstein. Quote, on January 13, 3 weeks after the Mexican peso collapsed, the Chase Manhattan Bank's Emerging Markets Group sent a 4-page report on Mexico to a group of its top clients. The Mexican economic crisis was threatening one of the hottest, quote, emerging markets, the term big institutional investors use to describe third world and Eastern European countries that have deregulated their economies and allowed foreigners to buy domestic stocks and bonds. Bankers are normally prudent with their utterances on political matters. Chase's unusual frankness here is due to the prospect of huge losses on its Mexican operations. Not content with dispensing this recipe for Mexican recovery to the bank's rich clients, the report's author, Riordan Rhett, briefed every available ear on Capitol Hill, including Senator Bob Dole, end quote, on the need to, quote, eliminate the Zapatistas, according to Rhett. Quote, the uprising in the southern state of Chiapas is now 1 year old and apparently no nearer to resolution. The leader, or spokesman of the movement, Subcomandante Marcos, remains adamant in his demand that the incumbent PRI governor resign and be replaced by the PRD candidate who, Marcos argues, was deprived of victory by government fraud in the recent election. Marcos continues to lobby for widespread social and economic reform in the state. Incidents continue between the local police and military authorities and those sympathetic to the Zapatista movement, as the insurgency is called, and local peasant groups who are sympathetic to Marcos and his cronies. While Chiapas, in our opinion, does not pose a fundamental threat to Mexican political stability, it is perceived to be so by many in the investment community. The government will need to eliminate the Zapatistas to demonstrate their effective control of the national territory and of security policy, end quote. Cockburn and Silverstein translate this in their editorial, quote, this crucial paragraph manages, in but 4 lines, to accelerate from traditional boilerplate about stability and investor perceptions to a peremptory demand that the Mexican government deploy its military against the peasants of Chiapas. 1 paragraph earlier, Chase effectively dismisses the alternative solution, social and economic reforms designed to offer a better life to Mexico's poor, on the grounds that such expenditures would be frivolous in the face of the pressing need to pay off investors. Confronted with the word eliminate, Chase offered the desperate excuse that Rhett spoke for himself and not the bank. But less than a month after Chase circulated this document and pressed for its brusque stipulations, President Zedillo unleashed the Mexican army against the Zapatistas in a brief assault, one of whose major purposes appears to have been the display of resolve demanded by Chase and Wall Street, end quote. On the integrity of Mexican elections, Rhett continues, quote, the Zedillo administration will need to consider carefully whether or not to allow opposition victories if fairly won at the ballot box. To deny legitimate electoral victories by the opposition will be a serious setback in the president's electoral strategy. But A failure to retain PRI control runs the risk of splitting the governing party. We believe that the ability of the Zedillo administration to resolve the inherent conflicts in the 1995 electoral agenda will be instrumental in determining whether or not the government will be able to fulfill its pledge to liberalize Mexican politics. End quote. Again, Cockburn and Silverstein interpret for us. Quote, this barely muffled call for manipulation of elections should enter business histories as a rare public display of how the captains of capital view the democratic process. End quote. Rhett's wording does not speak to the efforts of a consultant advising a corporate client, but rather a consultant issuing a stark warning to the very government he is criticizing. I would go a step further than Cockburn and Silverstein and say that this is not how corporate masters view the democratic process, but how they lend to it the illusion of existence. While masquerading as a memorandum to investors, Rhett gives specific instructions to the Mexican government and President Zedillo to keep investors happy. Quote, the government will need to eliminate the Zapatistas to demonstrate their effective control of the national territory and of security policy. The Zedillo administration will need to consider carefully whether or not to allow opposition victories if fairly won at the ballot box. In short, the Chase memo outlines two undesirable situations: the present condition of Mexican citizens who have lost purchasing power due to the peso's devaluation and are demanding wage increases, and the worsening financial crisis that would result from the Zedillo administration granting those wage increases to the unions. Keeping in mind that higher wages would negate the net benefits of cheaper Mexican labor by making it not as cheap, passing wage increases that would help Mexican workers regain footing after the lost decade would be a net loss for Chase's investors. Quote, if the crisis continues, the Zedillo administration may be faced with the options of either rejecting worker demands for higher wages and facing the possibility of demonstrations, or yielding to worker demands which will further aggravate the economic situations. End quote. While otherwise blunt, the wording in Rhett's conclusion is more delicate, almost philosophical. Quote, the Mexican monetary crisis has overshadowed the commitment of the Zedillo administration to a new wave of political reforms that include political negotiations to resolve the Chiapas crisis and to guarantee fair elections at the state and municipal levels. End quote. While Rhett's statements overall are grotesque enough, Rhett concludes the memo with a message that would make the Dulles brothers proud. Rhett claims that the severity of the peso crisis overshadows Zedillo's commitment to 1. Resolve the Chiapas crisis with negotiations, he advocates violence, and 2. Guarantee free state and municipal elections, he advocates election fixing. It takes a special kind of academic to devote one's career to studying the culture and politics of an entire geographic region, and to then use that knowledge against the citizens of that region to the benefit of strategic investors. To view fair elections as something to be withheld out of corporate financial interest is to grant sovereignty to the absurd. The assertion itself is a cognitive failure. In order to be refuted, it must from the start have some granular representation of and diversion from reality. Rhett does not even have the luxury of being wrong. He is, and I believe this assertion indeed has a granular representation of reality, an asshole. Rhett reveals a crucial tactic in the liberalization of Mexico, the invention of the ultimate villain. Mexico and any unstable trade partner becomes a villain to trade partners at large unless it capitulates to market pressures. But in its inevitable domestic failures, Mexico is the villain against itself. Poverty, low wages, and fixed elections in a emerging market make exploitation palatable. The U.S., as a matter of sport, finds it especially convenient to remind ourselves of our superiority to our southern neighbor and our willingness to treat them as subhuman. For example, quote, we also know that our federal prisons are filled with people that are here illegally. We are now feeding them 3 squares a day, a bed, we're giving them a gym. That's where I would start. Bite number 2. I think those people that are here incarcerated, they've committed crimes against the American people, violent crime. We have no obligation to continue to feed them going forward. End quote. That's from Steve Sutherland, representative from Florida's 2nd District, at the Sewanee REC meeting on September 2nd, 2010. We even do it to completely remove them from their actual identities. Quote, we know Al-Qaeda has camps over with the drug cartels on the other side of the Mexican border. We know that people are now being trained to come in and act like Hispanics when they are actually radical Islamists. End quote. That's Louis Gomer, representing the 1st District of Texas, in the C-SPAN Washington Journal on April 17, 2013. The Zapatista uprising does not end in a singular decisive moment. In 1996, Zedillo and the Zapatistas signed the San Andres Accords, which should have granted autonomy and rights to the Mayan in Chiapas, but the Mexican Congress refused to adopt them and Zedillo ignored the agreement. In response to the armed Zapatistas, local paramilitaries formed with state approval by non-intervention and began targeting other indigenous groups in Chiapas, like the strictly pacifist Las Abejas movement. Leaders of the anti-Zapatista indigenous resistance movement paramilitary were, in fact, paid $1,250 a month by the Mexican government to target the Zapatistas and any group sympathetic to them, a post-Vietnam, quote, low-intensity warfare strategy for controlling populations without direct government involvement. On December 22, 1997, this low-intensity warfare erupted at a Catholic chapel in the Acteal community, when 45 indigenous Maya Tzotzil, mostly women and children, also strictly pacifist, were murdered over the course of 5 hours. Machetes were used to, quote, cut babies out of the wombs of pregnant women, a tactic reminiscent of the feared Guatemalan Caibiles, an elite counterinsurgency unit that has reportedly trained 50 high-ranking Mexican military officers since the 1994 uprising, end quote. Paramilitary attacks on indigenous Maya continue today, most recently on August 14, 2020, when a paramilitary group from Santa Marta, Chinaljo, entered Aldama and began firing into the community, then retreated, a tactic that persisted for days and totaled more than 26 attacks altogether. The Mexican government refuses to intervene still. It continues in the tradition of low-intensity warfare against the crime, presumably, of being indigenous and alive. It seems kind of pointless to return to the subject of NAFTA, doesn't it? Well, anyway. The consequence of NAFTA's increase in Mexican manufacturing and foreign investment meant that large industrialized cities would need more workers, and those workers would come from the more rural parts of Mexico. That was good, because as Subcomandante Marcos warned, rural farmers would be out of work thanks to NAFTA opening up Mexican agriculture to U.S. and Canadian markets, and indigenous populations were at risk of losing the right to remain on their land. Just like in the U.S., a small family farmer in Mexico cannot grow quantities of produce at the scale needed for international trade. And just like in the U.S., the maximum value of land cannot be extracted if indigenous people occupy it. But NAFTA occurred alongside the rise of China as an industrial trade partner, which put immense pressure on Mexico's cheap labor force. China could produce more product at lower prices, and they could transport their products faster as well. Quote, Mexican producers advantage the proximity by rail and truck to the U.S. for high-value per-pound goods, such as consumer electronics, has been obliterated by the 18-hour Federal Express 747 flight between Shanghai and Memphis, end quote. In certain industrial areas, NAFTA indeed had its intended effect. Think localized net success, growth, production, and work opportunities, with no gross benefit for the nation. Automotive, electrical, and electronics industries that had been established in Mexico prior to NAFTA in 1994 were the primary beneficiaries of the deal, making up 53.46% of total manufacturing exports. What's especially remarkable in NAFTA is that, to Canada, it was a relatively meaningless arrangement. After all, the effects on the Canadian economy from the FTA were clear, no net benefit. That Mexico would be rolled into the equation with its even lower costs of production speaks volumes about a core economic principle, particularly that someone, some party at least, has to lose in order for another party to win. There is no power in balanced trade, but there is certainly power in imbalance. Take the issue of trade deficits from the U.S. perspective. The U.S. is spending more than it makes on the sale of stuff to trade partners. We're losing money, at least that's the narrative. For all Trump's blathering about NAFTA, specifically his claim to Fox News' Sean Hannity in 2018 that the U.S. lost millions of jobs to Mexico, he never once gets anything right other than the core argument that NAFTA was poor policy. He has no idea why it was poor policy. The U.S. didn't lose millions of jobs to NAFTA, closer to 850,000, give or take, but the U.S. has lost millions of jobs to China after President Clinton officialized normal trade relations with China in 2000. 3.2 million jobs affecting all states from 2001 to 2013. More to the point, the bulk of outsourcing to Mexico was due to the liberalization of the Mexican market. Restrictions on foreign direct investment were lifted to the tune of a 150% increase by 2013. And somewhere in the Mexican jungle, indigenous people were being murdered for the rights of foreigners to directly invest in the Mexican economy. The imbalance of trade would be a net loss for the U.S. if surplus revenues received by Mexico went to Mexican firms. But they don't even do that. New York-based Constellation Brands is the third largest beer company in the U.S. and holds an alcohol portfolio containing Robert Mondavi, Franciscan Estates, Nelson Greenbrier, Tennessee Whiskey, Svedka, and owns Grupo Modelo. Constellation brews and imports Corona, Modelo, Pacifico, Victoria, and China's Tsingtao. In 2013, they acquired their imported beer business and since then began a $4 billion investment in their Mexico beer expansion projects, with $520 million invested in 2020. Beer sales alone brought in $5.6 billion in revenue for 2020. 79% of Mexico's vehicle production is exported to the United States. General Motors, one of the top automakers in Mexico alongside Nissan, announced in 2019 that they would be closing 3 assembly plants: Detroit Hamtramck in Michigan, Lordstown, Ohio, and Oshawa, Ontario, and has been retooling production facilities in San Luis Potosi and Ramos Arizpe, where they produce SUVs and trucks for the U.S. market. Foxconn, the Taiwanese manufacturer with major manufacturing facilities in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, builds products for U.S. companies Dell, Cisco, and Hewlett-Packard. Ciudad Juarez also happens to be, quote, one of the places where the U.S. authorities send migrants without papers apprehended on U.S. soil, irrespective of where they originally came from. These repatriated migrants join the pools of laborers without any possessions or social support networks. The options facing them are bleak: working in the maquiladoras for a low wage, or joining one of the criminal gangs that now even post notices in the city's main streets to recruit members. It's a similar choice to the dilemma plaguing the young working-class people from the local area." End quote. The winner in the lopsided trade balance, in spite of its deficit, is the U.S. And again, imposing higher tariffs on those countries does not revamp domestic production. Trump's claim that jobs have disappeared to other countries, while valid, is not remedied by tariffs. The blame, are we to use our rational economic brains, is to be placed on the policies that export jobs to markets with the cheapest labor, and the country with the cheapest labor would be, as a matter of course, the country with the highest need for employment in general. See austerity measures and reduced government spending. See also high national debt. See also the lost decade. The cheapness of Mexican manufacturing is nothing short of imposed poverty for the 6.5 million Mexican workers earning minimum wage. Even a 20% wage increase by President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador only raised the minimum wage to 123.22 pesos per day, or $6.53 per day. This was part 2 of Unfuck the Poor, Chapter 9, Only Villains. Part 3 is up next.